The Enemy Within was one of the earliest stories, and, Sulu, I'm not convinced take your pet to work day is actually a thing. You're just jealous, sir. Things take a turn for the worse.
What happened? Get off that bank, sir.
I was setting up the hot dog cart like you wanted, Captain, and now you've wasted all that good mustard. You're on report, mister. The guy gets beamed up to be treated, but there's a problem. Scotty barely gets him to materialize. Must be something in all that stuff he's covered in.
Decontaminate that uniform.
Yes, sir. That acted like a burnout.
Well, he smokes the occasional roach, sir, but I wouldn't go that far. Kirk gets beamed up next, and it's a bit rough. Not as bad as the last guy, but Kirk is stumbling off the transporter pad, and usually the only stumbling here is when Scotty shows up for his shift after last call. Well, what should happen next but another of him appears on the pad. What sells the scene is it's just so subtle. After the titles, the captain's log explains what happened, but in the past tense so that it makes sense, unlike ones where Kirk will stop in the middle of a fist fight and make a log entry. Evil Kirk is a bit deranged, and after ogling the transporter controls, swaggers his way out to get into trouble. Bones is dealing with the injured guy. Are you sure this isn't overdoing it? My hands aren't that dirty, are they? I'll be the judge of that. Now hand me that bucket of acid. Evil Kirk arrives demanding Saurian brandy. And I mean demanding. Bones gives it to him, though that means that there are only 16 other bottles stashed around sickbay now. So he sends Spock to check up on Kirk, who naturally has no idea what the hell he's talking about, and just dismisses that it says Bones pulling a practical joke. On a completely unrelated topic, there are now 2 of Sulu's dog rhinos. One is docile, and the other is nasty and mean. That means that Sulu and the landing party are stuck down on the planet until they have this little problem solved. Evil Kirk's next stop is Yeoman Rand's quarters, and is quickly getting a little handsy, even for the 60s, until she's fighting back against him and even scratches his face. Finally, someone happens by and leaves to go tattle on him, so Evil Kirk chases him down and kicks the shit out of him. But other Kirk is confused when Spock confronts him. He's been resting in here, he hasn't been to sickbay, taken any brandy, and is pretty sure that if he tried to rape someone, he would remember. He's a gentleman like that. He shows that there are no scratches on his face, but she says that Fisher saw him too, right before Kirk beat the tar out of him.
Back to that bed, Bucko. Come on.
Bucko? What are you, Potsy now? Spock concludes that the only thing that squares her testimony with Kirk's is that there's some imposter on board. But to what purpose? Who goes to all the trouble to look exactly like a starship captain just so they can come on board and look around for booze to swipe and to screw somebody? I'd like to think that if you were capable of that, you could probably come across both those things with a lot less trouble. They quickly figure out that whatever happened to the rhino dog must have happened to Kirk. There's another him running around making trouble, so they'll need to form a search party with phasers locked on stun, so that there is no chance that he'll be killed in case that affects Kirk himself. But an explanation is going to be called for. Telling people to chase down and stun the captain sounds like either Spock trying a mutiny or Kirk satisfying a particularly bizarre whim. Let me just strip down to my Speedo and grease myself up before we get started, everyone. Kirk figures that the answer is to just tell the crew what has happened, but that would undermine his command, as Spock notes.
You can't afford the luxury of being anything less than perfect.
That's why we had all copies of your movie The Incubus destroyed, remember? The fact that he needs to be reminded of this, though, is a matter of grave concern, and the way he was fumbling along with the decision says that this wasn't just a duplicate. Kirk's missing something, some part of himself. So he announces that his duplicate is an imposter who must be taken alive.
Repeat, the imposter is not to be injured.
That's right, Books, I'm the captain around here. But of course, he's right. He isn't a fake. He's just as much the captain of this ship as the guy who's sitting in that chair on the bridge. No wonder he's pissed off. It's just, we can't have a psychopath as a starship captain. Well, not again. For a third time, actually.
Captain Kirk! I'm Captain Kirk!
Subtlety, thy name is Shatner. While he disguises himself and steals a phaser, we check in on Sulu's group who are stranded down there. Why don't they just use a shuttlecraft? Well, there aren't any. Out of universe, this is because there was no plan to have them on the show. It was all going to be beaming. In universe, though, how do we explain that? Actually, it's pretty easy. Last week's episode was the naked time, when everybody on the ship got drunk off their asses. This week, there are now no working shuttles. You can fill in that blank with whatever you like. They can't give them any real help. Whatever's beamed down gets duplicated and non-functional. The portable heaters, for instance, don't work. The resulting pair are too corrupted and can't be, put together to make one working one. I mean, I'm sure Sulu's group has tried. It's not like they don't have a whole lot else that they've got to be doing right now. The only thing on their agenda is freezing to death. And that's really something that doesn't take up a whole lot of your actual effort. But the matter of the double. Kirk says if he was going to hide, he'd go to engineering. So he and Spock check it out and find Yellow Shirt Kirk, who hesitates in shooting Green Shirt Kirk, and only is foiled when he decides in the end that he's going to do it because Spock neck pinches the guy. He's secured in sickbay, where Spock notes that the unique opportunity is here to see the human mind split into what he might call the good side and the evil side, which is obviously the crux of this episode. While it is simpler to think of this as the good and the evil, there is a bit more complexity to all this. Richard Matheson, the writer for this episode, the same guy who created the famous I Am Legend, which has been adapted several times and arguably kickstarted the zombie genre. Anyway, Matheson drew upon a famous work, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. But while that is likewise considered the good doctor and the evil Hyde, the conflict was supposed to be less focused on such pure morality and more upon civility versus savagery. That Hyde was a throwback in body and mindset. And while evil Kirk is not a physical subhuman, he shows that same mental divide. Freud advanced the original idea of the id, ego, and superego, the three aspects of our personality. The id being primitive instinct, the ego the practical, and superego the sense of right and wrong. But what is commonly lost is that Freud's theory was that the ego was actually merely the id that had been adapted to dealing with the real world. It was interested in satisfying the desires of the id without leading to any real problems. Like the difference between the horse and the rider, it was said. The id was this powerful drive, and the ego could just hope to try to steer and control it to get where they both wanted without doing something rash in the process. The superego is instead driven by the desire to do the moral thing, both for its own sake and for the sake of one's own self-image. Thus, what it can be thought of is that Kirk hasn't been split into good or evil so much as the superego into one and the id-ego partnership into the other. This may seem an entirely academic distinction, but I think it's actually an important one. If, say, Kirk's brother was in mortal danger, Green Shirt Kirk would save him because it's the moral thing to do, and Yellow Shirt Kirk would also save him because it would sadden him if his brother were to die. His motivation is selfish, but it's different than an evil Kirk who would let his brother die purely for the amusement of it. And as for the good Kirk, he's becoming less effective because he is making life and death decisions, and how can one decide with imperfect knowledge to be so irresponsible and lead to an immoral end? Guilt, it is theorized, is merely the superego keeping the ego in check, to punish it when it is thoughtless. But its practicality, it is being suggested, is what allows Kirk to reach a decision in the face of the unknown, that the superego can pass judgment on the past, but it struggles with judging behavior in the present. Thus, as even Bones has to admit, Kirk needs to have both parts to be a whole man. In the words of Terry Pratchett, to be the place where the falling angel meets the rising ape. Scotty interrupts to call about the transporter. Seems some asshole's duplicate accidentally shot the wall where some of those controls were, and now the already screwed up thing is completely boned. He's going to have to fix this just so he can get back to fixing the thing that was broken in the first place. So thanks for the help, Captain. It's going to take a week to try to repair this, and the people on the planet are not going to survive the night. And speaking of lives in danger... My God, is that how I really look when I'm acting? Why has no one ever told me about this? Green Kirk tells Yellow Kirk, oh crap, I just realized that this is Superman Red, Superman Blue all over again. Green Kirk tries to reassure Yellow Kirk enough to get him to calm down and not make their growing health issues worse. As the embodiment of the more primitive emotions, it's no surprise that this Kirk is going to be more terrified of the idea of death, like he's a frightened animal. On that cheery note, let's get back to the transporter. Scotty has managed to cobble together a workaround, and they're going to do a test with that rhino dog to see if they can merge the two back into one creature. It works, but it doesn't.
Shock of bringing back together seems to have been too much for him.
He's dead, Jim.
The Man Trap aired first, but this episode was actually made before that, meaning that you have just heard for the first time that phrase. Who could have imagined such a famous phrase would first be used when talking about a dog? With that, Spock is effectively taking command, as Kirk is no longer in any condition to make decisions. Even on the matter of this experiment, he flip-flops like he's running for office. Spock thinks that this is the result of the animal, being a terrified and confused creature, being unable to cope with the shock of being thrust back into one being again, but something as intelligent as a person could. Bones thinks that's all theory. Spock thinks the men on the planet need action. Bones thinks that if it doesn't work, then Kirk is going to die and they'll die anyway, so Spock brings up that he's two halves thrust together and is speaking from experience, with Kirk looking back and forth between them until you expect him to say, 15, love. Kirk finally decides to ready the transporter, but has the autopsy on the rhino dog continue, just to cover his bases. But time is just about out, as Sulu notes.
Sulu, here. 117 below.
Is that Celsius or Fahrenheit? I mean, I'm just curious, because if it's Celsius, it might get cold enough for us to watch the liquid nitrogen rain. Well, that makes up Green Kirk's mind, but Yellow Kirk isn't so convinced. So he tricks Green Kirk into releasing him, overpowers him, and puts on a green shirt to fool everybody. He heads to the bridge and orders them to leave orbit, but then the real Green Kirk shows up with Bones, and it's pretty obvious which is which. The hamminess kind of gives it away. Yellow Kirk is too afraid of death, but Green Kirk assures him it's going to be okay.
Hold on to him, Captain.
Mr. Spock,
Captain.
if this doesn't work,
Don't tell anyone I died hugging another man. I've got an image to maintain. Well, they try it, and it works. One Kirk comes back. He's alive and seemingly sane, and orders the men beamed up to show that he's got his mojo back. That just leaves the final part, where Spock comments about the interesting qualities of the animal-like Kirk to Yeoman Rond, upsetting some at his incredible insensitivity towards a woman who was nearly violated, but delighting others who feel this makes perfect sense if all their Kirk/Spock fanfics were true, and he was pointing out a moment of shared delight in the carnal aspects of their savage captain. It's a real pick-your-own-ending kind of episode. Post-episode follow-up. Annoying character goes to evil rhino dog. I hate the sound of tiny dogs barking. All scores are relative to their series. Final score for The Enemy Within is 7 out of 10. That might be controversial because this is considered a classic, and I'm not saying that it isn't, but it is a classic because of its uniqueness, and showing us that the only man who can hold his own acting opposite of William Shatner is William Shatner. I'm just kidding. This score is not a negative. There's a lot of great episodes in this series, remember, and it does little good to stack everything at the top end of the list. But given its shaky premise, the episode holds up surprisingly well, making time to look at the questions at the center of it all instead of being focused solely upon the good versus evil running around the ship against each other plot. It also showed that the transporter, created as a money-saving device, could be used to create both special dramatic effects and explain entire plot lines. An important lesson. A good question to always ask you when you're creating fiction is, what if this special thing that I've introduced goes wrong? What if this thing that we have come to rely upon suddenly doesn't work the way we expect it to? Your special watch that freezes time, or your teleporting car. Always ask what happens if this reliable thing suddenly were to stop working, or if it worked wrong. And don't just say it'll split you into two halves, because, that's just been done.
down to 120 degrees below zero.
That's nippy.